This video is sponsored by manscaped.com, but more on that in a moment. Petro's victory in Colombia, Gabriel Boric's government in Chile, the possible return of Lula in Brazil, and the arrival of Pedro Castillo to power in Peru. Latin America is once again immersed in a huge wave of political change. A change that clearly bets on the resurgence of left-wing parties and politicians. A new left, apparently much less radical and much more social democratic than the one we knew as the so-called socialism of the 21st century. But what if I told you that we could find a tiny exception, a small one among giants that is turning the other way and that aspires to become a model for the future Argentina? Do you know what country I am referring to? In this case, I'm referring to Uruguay.
The success of a ruler is not measured in the reflection of a mirror, it is measured in the reflection of each one of the Uruguayans and the people who live in the country. If people look at themselves in the mirror when our government term ends and are freer, the government is successful. If not, we will have failed. For me, fundamentally. Luis Lacalle Pou, President of Uruguay.
The story we are looking at today began on the Sunday the 27th of October 2019. On that day, as happens every 5 years, presidential elections took place in Uruguay. And we are not talking about just any elections. For the first time in 15 years, there was an alternation in power. On that day, the Frente Amplio, the leftist coalition that had been governing Uruguay since 2004, was defeated. A defeat that, in all fairness, was by a very narrow margin. You see, after coming in second and a long way behind the Frente Amplio in the first round, and with the memory of the second round and defeats of his father in 2009 and of himself in 2014, Lacalle Pou finally won power by a very narrow margin of little more than 1.5 points. A mere 37,000 votes was enough to turn Uruguayan politics upside down. Now, what made Uruguayan voters decide to go for Lacalle Pou? When did this 180-degree turnaround happen? What does it mean in the Latin American political context? And the most important question of all, more than enough time has passed since the election, so the question we're all wondering is, how has Uruguay changed since then? Well, we want to find out, so let's get cracking.
The new popular mandate.
What brought Lacalle Pou to power after 15 years of political domination by the Frente Amplio? What exactly did the current president of Uruguay come up against? Well, VisualPolitik fans, in order to answer this question, we have to go back to 2019. At that time, we can highlight three major issues that concerned and even threatened the future of the country. First of all, there is the issue of security. You see, Uruguay has always been a relatively safe country, but that all began to change in 2011. In the following 8 years, the homicide rate practically doubled. And something that had never been a noteworthy concern, security, began to become one of the key issues on the political agenda. The situation was getting so bad that some sectors even began to call for the armed forces to take control of internal security to the detriment of the police.
Lack of security, the issue that worries Uruguay the most ahead of the elections. Concern over record increases in murders and violent robberies in Uruguay. Homicides grew by 45.8% and violent robberies by 53.5% in the last year.
But that was not all. Secondly, after 15 years of the Frente Amplio's redistributive policies, the economy was exhausted, practically kaput. For example, Uruguay's economic growth went from 4.6% in 2013 to zero growth in 2019. Poverty had begun to grow and the public deficit had soared to almost 5% of GDP, one of the biggest budget slippages in Uruguay's entire history. To top it off, increasing regulations and ever more government intervention caused the country to fall back to 101st place in the World Bank's Doing Business ranking. In other words, the fear that the Argentine disease would take its toll on the country was more real than ever. And finally, we have one of the most common epidemics in all of Hispanic countries: corruption. To give you an idea, the vice president of the country himself, Raul Sandik, was accused of corruption, accusations for which he was ultimately convicted in 2021. Lack of security, economic stagnation, and corruption. Three ingredients that together spell one outcome: institutional degradation. Yes, in 2019, Uruguay was one of the best countries in Latin America in economic, political, and social terms. But things were simply not going in the right direction. And right at that point, Lacalle Pou appeared with a very clear message to make a 180-degree turn in the country's policies. And, my VisualPolitik fans, that was none other than the reason he allowed him to defeat the Frente Amplio, the promise of building a new Uruguay. Of course, it is one thing to win elections and quite another to have a blank check. The small margin with which it won the elections has forced the government to depend on a complex 5-party alliance in order to achieve a majority in Congress, both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. It is known as the Multicolor Coalition. Of course, you can imagine that behind the name, keeping 5 parties united is not always an easy task. And of course, it is something that forces you to keep everyone happy. In other words, to agree on any reform requires a lot of dialogue and negotiation. To top it all off, coming to power in 2019 and suffering a pandemic in 2020, that's, how should I put this? It's a real pain in the ass. You come to power and before long, your political and economic priorities have changed completely. All in all, Lacalle Pou's government has managed to introduce important changes in the country. These changes are radically different from what is being done in practically all the countries in the region and, in some cases, may end up provoking an enormous political clash with neighbouring countries. Do you want to know what we are talking about and how the land of the Charrua is changing? Of course you do. So let's get started. But before we get to that, there comes a time in a man's life when he has to shave down there. And believe me, when that moment comes, I do not recommend using a regular razor. A friend of mine tried that and now we call him Uno. That's all I can say. In other words, there is only one realistic option for trimming below the waist, and that's Manscaped. This is the performance package by Manscaped, an all-in-one starter kit for body hair grooming and hygiene. Included in the package is the marvelous Lawnmower 4.0 electric trimmer. With its unique skin-safe technology, it helps prevent nicks and cuts. And don't worry, I'm not going to give you a demonstration in front of the camera. Since this trimmer is both cordless and waterproof, you can use it in the shower or run it under the sink to prevent any messy cleanup. And the razor even has a little built-in LED light that helps us to see better in all the little nooks and crannies, and it even has a travel log for when you go traveling. But that's not all. In addition to this razor, the Manscaped performance package includes an epilator for nose hairs, the so-called weed whacker, and 2 deodorants designed for the male crotch, the crop preserver and the crop reviver. Now that summer is coming, they'll come in especially handy. As always, we have a very special discount for all of you who follow VisualPolitik. Basically, if you use the code VPEN, you will get a 20% discount, plus free international shipping. So wherever you are, you can get Manscaped plus a free pair of boxer briefs and a free toiletry bag. Remember folks, Manscaped, the perfect tools for your family jewels. And now, let's get back to the video.
Rebuild Uruguay.
Pay close attention to the following news item.
Uruguay, Bahamas, and Portugal, the chosen countries by Argentines for their tax benefits.
Obviously, Uruguay is far from being a tax haven, but it does have much better conditions than Argentina, especially if the income comes from abroad. And above all, what is improved are the prospects for the future, which is particularly important when you want to put your savings aside for safekeeping, don't you think? And of course, things like this help a lot.
Uruguay approved tax vacations for 10 years for foreigners obtaining residency. More benefits in Uruguay. Lacalle Pou approved a tax relaxation for companies that settle and invest in that country.
However, of all the reform processes that the Uruguayan government has implemented in recent years, there is one that stands out above all the rest. I am referring, of course, to the Law of Urgent Consideration, LUC for those in the know. We're talking about a very long law with 476 articles that deals with all kinds of issues from the economy to education, including communication services. It is the government's great transformation project, and take note, because after its approval, an appeal made by the Frente Amplio meant that a large part of the changes had to be submitted to a referendum. And once again, the Uruguayans, again by a narrow margin of just 2 points, voted in favor of the reforms.
The Uruguayan executives come out strengthened after a referendum that keeps the country divided. Uruguay, with a narrow margin, the government wins a key referendum for its administration by only 22,000 votes. The majority of Uruguayans backed the option not to repeal 135 of 476 articles of the so-called Law of Urgent Consideration, LUC, promoted by President Luis Lacalle Pou.
Now, what exactly does this LUC say? What are its most salient changes? Well, among the other reforms that we can talk about, the main ones we can find are: in economic matters, a ceiling has been set on growth of public spending and a limit on the level of debt, as well as the creation of a fiscal council to evaluate the different public spending projects and try to avoid political waste. Secondly, in labour matters, from now on, when a strike day occurs, the right of employers and employees to work if they so wish will be expressly recognised. Until now, even if a worker did not want to join a strike, the so-called Passive Freedom of Association of 2006 could prevent him or her from working on that day. Among the same lines, the LUC also declares pickets that impede the free movement of people, goods, or services, both in public and private spaces, to be illegitimate and illegal. In other words, you can go on strike, but you cannot force others to go on strike, nor can you stop the country. Then, in terms of security, the law broadens the circumstances and places in which both civilians and police can resort to self-defense. And in terms of housing, a new voluntary rental regime is introduced that reduces the rights of tenants. This regime recognizes, for example, faster evictions in cases of non-payment. The idea is that more landlords will put their properties on the market, and this will somehow bring down prices. Well, these are just some of the many changes with the Lacalle Pou government now want to turn the tide in Uruguay. And the next step seems to be the tricky reform of social security, after a commission of experts in 2020 will confirm what is already an open secret. With the aging of the population, the public social security system as it is set up in Uruguay is unviable. To give you an idea, social security expenditure in Uruguay is similar to that of Spain and even higher than that of wealthy countries such as Denmark or Norway. So it is time to get down to work. Anyway, with all that we've seen, what do you want me to say? You may take or leave the current Uruguayan government, but VisualPolitik fans, I think one thing is clear. They are nothing like what is happening in the rest of Latin America. But wait a moment, we are not finished yet. Another key, fundamental, and completely disruptive bet of this government has a lot to do with foreign policy, and especially to do with Mercosur. We are talking about a gamble that may end up doing no less than making Montevideo send Buenos Aires and Brasilia to hell. Check this out.
A new pathway to the world.
Take a look at this statement of intent.
My duty as a Uruguayan is to ask the world to open up to me, because if you open up the world to us, we will walk safely. Luis Lacalle Pou, President of Uruguay.
VisualPolitik viewers, since his arrival to power, Pou has understood that above all, there is something that does not work in this region of the world. Something we have told you about many times here on VisualPolitik. The import substitution policy and the rampant protectionism that characterizes these countries. So, no sooner said than done, to Argentina's great annoyance, you'll understand why later, the new government of Uruguay was faced with three important foreign policy challenges as soon as it came to power. Firstly, to make it more pro-market. Secondly, to contribute to making Mercosur more flexible. And thirdly, to facilitate the arrival of more foreign direct investment in the country. Well, that, and also to put all populist chieftains in the region on the same footing. That is, clearly condemning the regimes of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Let's not get sidetracked. Let's focus on what has been the Uruguayan government's big gamble in foreign affairs. Take a look at this.
Uruguay needs to open up to the world. If they accompany us, fine. If not, we go alone. Luis Lacalle Pou, President of Uruguay. On Mercosur, we are in the boat. We have to think about who is in the cargo. We want to move forward, and we are going to do it. In Uruguay, we are trying to negotiate with China, Turkey, with the United Kingdom. Luis Lacalle Pou, President of Uruguay.
So, it's crystal clear. The current Uruguayan government is clear that in order to secure more investment and better economic growth, the country has to open up to the world. The problem is that at the same time, it wants to negotiate new trade agreements. Uruguay belongs to Mercosur, and this limits its room for maneuver, which explains news like this one.
Uruguay's rebelliousness strains Mercosur to the maximum.
We have also told you here on VisualPolitik, the Southern Common Market, Mercosur, does not work, at least not as it should. This institution was supposed to promote trade in South America, however, with a common external tariff that more than doubles the global average and certain limitations when negotiating with third countries. So, in practice, this agreement works more like a protectionist barrier. For this reason, the Lacalle Pou government has launched a political war to make the bloc more flexible, reduce the common external tariff, and allow member countries to negotiate trade agreements with third countries on their own. This is something that Mercosur's current regulations prevent. Of course, so far, the results have not at all been positive. Buenos Aires, above all, continues to insist that this bloc be what it is today, a sort of closed box that instead of encouraging trade, slows it down. Well, you understand by now the aversion Argentine politicians have to free trade and globalization. The lack of real interest in moving forward with the free trade agreement with the European Union is a good example of this. Now, the point is that Uruguay is close to signing a free trade agreement with China, and probably with other countries as well. And China alone already weighs more in Uruguay's export basket than its Mercosur neighbors. Does this mean that the land of the Charrua could end up leaving Mercosur? It doesn't seem that straightforward because its bloc partners still dominate imports. But if things continue like this in the future, it would not be out of the question. The world is much bigger than Mercosur. In fact, since 2019, the weight of exports in GDP that had been falling since 2014 has started to grow again. And in 2021, although the external balance remained negative, it had its second lowest level of the last 12 years. It was only improved by the extraordinary figure of the 2020s when the imports collapsed due to the pandemic. And what does all this mean? Well, it is not just a simple stubbornness of the president. The foreign market is very much in Uruguay's favor. In fact, exports soared in 2021 and are doing the same in 2022. Now, the global food crisis triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine promises to boost exports even further. And if Pou's plans come to fruition, it is clear that the foreign sector will play a key role in Uruguay's economic future. And so, there you have it. Ultimately, despite the pandemic, the economy has improved. Unemployment is about to break its most positive record in 7 years, poverty is contracting, and crime is down substantially. Much remains to be done, but the data is clear. Today, things in Uruguay seem to be on the right track, or at least on a better path than they were on in 2019. And that, in a region full of problems, is a breath of fresh air. This perhaps explains why Uruguay is practically the only exception to the shift to the left that is taking place throughout Latin America. The question now is, can the reforms promoted by the Pou government become a model for countries such as Argentina? How far will the changes promoted by the current president of Uruguay go? Will Uruguayans reevaluate this reform path in the 2024 elections? These are the questions, and in this case, the answers are over to you. If you like, leave us your impression in the comments and let's open a friendly debate. And, as always, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to all of us here at VisualPolitik. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.